Yes, little child. Do you come from a terrifying village of cats? Do you know dark magic? Maybe. Maybe so.
Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned. For my weekly reading report, it's time for my weekly reading report. That fantastic program where I talk about all the stuff that I read the previous week. And I did read some stuff, Roger. Not as much stuff as I would have liked. Because last week was busy, man. I think this week is probably going to be busy too, but not as busy as last week. Last week was rough. But I did read some stuff. I read a couple things. I finished a couple books. So let's talk about those things that I finished. I will break out my list for the 500 book challenge. The 500 book challenge, the never-ending challenge, where I have to read 500 books that I own before I'll buy any new ones. And when I last spoke to you on this delightful program, I had just started, I believe, book 298, which was The Hour of the Oxford Dead by Charles L. Grant. This book right there, floating in the air mysteriously. So, as I've mentioned before, I had intended to get back to Charles L. Grant and revisit his work because it's been a long time since I read any of his books. And I remember having mixed feelings about his work when I read it. But that was back in like the 80s and early 90s when I read his stuff. And this is his first really successful horror novel. It's the first in the Oxford Station series of books, which is a series of books that are based in Oxford Station, New Jersey, a place full of supernatural happenings. You know, it's prone to supernatural shenanigans. Oxford Station, and this book, The Hour of the Oxford Dead, is really, really good. I was pretty impressed by this book. Charles L. Grant is known for his quiet horror. Yeah, he wrote quiet horror, and this is a book that is kind of a slow burn. It's not a long book, but it does take its time building up the suspense and the feeling of dread. We have a young librarian who's a widow, and she discovers a mysterious conspiracy of some kind. She's not quite sure what it is for most of the book, but she knows something's going on, and that she is a target, that somebody wants her dead. And she gets the aid of a young, very 1970s reporter who helps her out. And of course, they fall in love and have a romance. And it's a really entertaining, engaging book. You know, there's some kind of mysterious creature out there murdering people, probably under the direction of somebody. And like I said, there's a conspiracy going on, and you don't know how many people in the town are in on it. And it's really good. It did take what I felt to be quite a surprise turn towards the end of the book, in that it became kind of a different kind of story towards the very end, because the very end, or towards the end, suddenly it became a story straight out of Weird Tales magazine. You know, and I was not expecting that. You know, at one point, heading towards the end of the book, you discover what the conspiracy is, and you have a character who is essentially an evil wizard. You basically have what is basically an evil wizard show up. And, you know, he is such a mustache twirling villain, you know. I will tell you my entire evil plan. And it is this. And he tells him the entire evil plan, you know, and he has to get back his magic book, and, you know, there are magic rings, and it really becomes a Weird Tales story. And then when you finally get to the end, the ending is straight out of a Jules de Grandin story, only without Jules de Grandin. It's unfortunate, Roger, that Jules de Grandin wasn't still around in the 1970s, because if he was, he could have come over to Oxford Station and just had this whole thing figured out in 30 pages. He would have taken care of business. But he wasn't around by the 1970s, so it took a whole novel to get this whole thing worked out. And the ending is, like I said, it's straight out of Weird Tales magazine. It's very pulpy, and I just wasn't expecting that turn. And then it's over, and then it's just all over. And then it's just very abruptly end. It ends very abruptly, and it's just like, okay, I guess it's done. Charles L. Grant was like, okay, enough of this book. I'm moving on. And then it was over. But I really enjoyed it, I have to say. And I do certainly want to read more of his work. So I will read the next book in the series. I forget the title of the next book in the series. But this book was great. The Hour of the Oxford Dead was really a good book. So there you go. 1970s horror novel, The Hour of the Oxford Dead. So that was book number 298. That led me to book 299, which was this book. This is The Complete John Silence Stories by Algernon Blackwood. This is part of Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. This is the October pick for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. Roger's Cheap Old Book Club is the cheapest book club around. Every book in his book club is available for free on Project Gutenberg, including Algernon Blackwood's John Silence. And the first edition of this book is available for free on Project Gutenberg. It was called John Silence, Physician Extraordinary. This particular edition has an extra story that was not in that original edition. Although the story is okay, but not great, so you don't really need to read that one. It was a decent story, though. Most of the stories in this are excellent. This is about John Silence, a psychic doctor. He is literally psychic. And he also is an occult detective, which makes this book very appropriate for Occult Detective October, which is an event going on in BookTube right at this very moment. Algernon Blackwood is one of my favorite classic horror writers, and these stories are by and large pretty excellent horror stories, really entertaining. He's a very good writer, Algernon Blackwood, and he's a guy that, he did not sleepwalk through life like some people do. He lived a life, Algernon Blackwood, and he paid attention to the life that he was living. And he put a lot of his experiences into his stories, which certainly give them a feeling of authenticity when you read them. You could tell that a lot of the experiences or places that he talks about he's been to, and he's had experiences in these places. At the same time, they are supernatural horror stories, and we have an occult detective, basically, John Silence, who has trained himself to master his psychic abilities, and he's learned all about supernatural phenomena to help people out with very special problems, like haunted houses and stuff like that. And these are just, as stories, they're just tremendously entertaining and very well done. The first story, a psychical invasion. It's called A Psychical Invasion, which is basically a haunted house story starring John Silence, a dog, and a cat. Because he takes a dog and a cat with him to this haunted house to help him, banish the ghosts, basically, or the supernatural manifestation in this house. And it sounds silly, and it is a little silly, but it's actually quite entertaining and interesting. So there's that. I enjoyed the first story, but the next story is excellent. The next story in this book is Ancient Sorceries. Ancient Sorceries is interesting for a few different reasons. One reason is that John Silence doesn't take an active part in the story itself. It's basically a guy who has a weird experience and tells him his weird experience and gets John Silence's opinion on it. So it's basically just him listening to a story. It's also interesting because if you read this, you can see that H.P. Lovecraft, who admired Blackwood, probably was influenced a little bit by this story in his writing of The Shadow over Innsmouth. The situation is quite different as far as what's going on in the mysterious town that this stranger goes to. But you can see, I think, that there is some influence there. In this story, we have kind of a meek young fellow who gets off a train and kind of spontaneously visits this town in France. And it's a very strange town. All the people in the town are very, they're very aloof. Yet he always feels that they're all watching him, no matter what he's doing. He'll walk around the streets, and he thinks everybody's pretending not to notice him. They all ignore him, but he feels like they're all really keeping him under observation. And he ends up spending quite a lot of time in this town. He can't bring himself to leave. And eventually he discovers that all of these people aren't just strange. They could be werecats. This could be an entire town of werecats. People who are also cats. It's that kind of village, And he meets a young woman that he falls in love with. And it's possible, as it turns out, that he might be a reincarnation of a sorcerer who used to live in this town at one time. It's a little odd. And it's full of cats. So it's excellent. I'm not doing it justice, but trust me, Ancient Sorceries is an excellent story. And it's one of those stories that's been anthologized a few times. Then we have The Nemesis of Fire, which is awesome. It's a very awesome, very pulpy sort of mummy story. It's a sort of a mummy story, Roger, which is probably why Roger liked it so much. That story is a lot of fun, very well told. We have John Silence using all of his knowledge to defeat this strange supernatural something, which is causing fires all over the place on this one property and terrorizing the inhabitants of the people who live in the area and the inhabitants of this estate. And it's really good. It's excellent. This does showcase one of the few things that I think are probably a weakness of the John Silence stories, in that John Silence, he explains the supernatural or supernatural events in very pseudo-scientific terms. It seems that Algernon Blackwood himself was a victim of many pseudoscientific ideas, which, when you hear John Silence explain in his pseudoscientific jargon, when he explains things, and it just all sounds ridiculous because the science is clearly wrong, and a lot of the ways that John Silence views the world is clearly just wrong. It's just wrong. But in the stories, all of this stuff is real, and he's right. But what I find sometimes in fiction is when you try to explain the supernatural in scientific terms, it kind of loses some of its power a little bit. It becomes less frightening and harder to believe in an odd kind of way. And there's a little bit of that going on in this story. However, the menace is so menacing, and there is a tragedy that happens that even John Silence cannot avert because this is such a serious situation. And the story has just a great sense of atmosphere, like most of his Algernon Blackwood stories do. All around, really, really excellent story. That's followed by Secret Worship, about a guy who visits a school that he went to in Germany when he was just a teenager, and he revisits this school, and what he finds is quite unexpected and terrifying. And he needs to be saved by John Silence, who just happens to be there. Great story, and another story that you see anthologized frequently, Secret Worship, because it's just so good. That's followed by The Camp of the Dog, which is a very strange werewolf story. It's not a particularly scary story. The menace in this story, the kind of strange werewolf that is in this story, isn't a particularly scary werewolf. You never feel until one part towards the end that anybody's in any actual danger. One of the most interesting things about the story is, again, the sense of place is very strong. You can see that Algernon Blackwood is drawing on his own experiences in writing about this story. But not the best story in the volume, but still pretty good. The last story is a story that was not included in the original edition, which is A Victim of Higher Space, which is kind of silly. It's a short, kind of silly story that's actually kind of funny. But it does have a great description of John Silence's his headquarters, his chambers, and that was kind of interesting. You get to see John Silence at work in a way that you haven't seen him before in the other stories. But a very short little story, which feels kind of tacked on in this volume. Certainly doesn't have the gravity or the menace that the other stories do, but it's nice to have in there. Altogether, this is a great book. I don't think the John Silence stories, by and large, are the best stories that Algernon Blackwood did. I think a lot of his other work is clearly superior to some of the things that you find in this. Nevertheless, this is excellent. This is an excellent book, The Complete John Silence Stories. This edition from Dover is available still, edited by S.T. Joshi. It's excellent. I highly recommend it. So there you go. That was The Complete John Silence Stories, which is Roger's pick for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club this month. Next month for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, it's going to be a fun one. We're going to be reading Gulliver of Mars from Edwin L. Arnold next month. So join us for that. That's going to be a good time. So that was book 299, which brings me to the book I'm reading at the moment. And I am a little over halfway through with The Red Hawk by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Book number 300. Can you believe it, Roger? We finally made it to 300 in the 500 book challenge. So I'm reading this at the moment. I probably will finish this today because it's just a wee little book, a short little book. And it's the last part of the Moon Maid trilogy. This story takes place hundreds of years after the last story, when humanity has been reduced to to basically different tribes of barbarians. And this story takes place in California. And in California, the tribes are modeled very much on Native American tribes, the way they kind of, the way their societies are kind of set up, but actually a little more barbaric and less sophisticated than that. The Moon Men who conquered the Earth have pretty much been wiped out, except for a couple of bands of these cow cars. And we have kind of a final confrontation, which is going to happen in this book, it looks like. Full of adventure and daring do and fun, and quite interesting. I will talk more about this book next week when I finish it, when I finished it. But this is the last of the 3 volumes from the centennial edition of The Moon Maid. Again, these books in this set are fantastic. They just have great artwork all the way through, and they're just awesome books. And so I will, like I said, tell you more about this book once I've finished it. But it looks to be just as good as the other 2. It looks like it's going to be just as good as those other 2 stories. That is mostly what I read. I read a little bit of this, but not much of this, because I wanted to get up through book 300 on the 500 book challenge. So I kind of concentrated on everything else that I was reading and put the Fantastic Four down for this week. Although I'm going to be picking it back up and trying to catch up with the Fantastic Four. I am reading every issue of the Fantastic Four from the first run of the Fantastic Four. And I just finished yesterday, actually. What issue did I finish? I finished issue 365. So I have quite a bit more to go. And I'm going to be catching up this week on my Fantastic Four. I don't know, as far as books, what else I'll be reading this week. I did get in the mail the latest issue of Occult Detective magazine, just in time for Occult Detective October. This is issue number 11. This is the summer issue. It is the biggest issue yet of Occult Detective magazine. This was sent to me by one of the editors, Dave Brzezinski. Thank you very much, Dave, for sending me this issue of Occult Detective. So I very well might pick this up as the next thing that I read. I'm not exactly sure. But it's got a great cover. I mean, look at that. Occult Detective magazine is a fantastic magazine. All 11 issues. It actually began its life as Occult Detective Quarterly. And I think it was issue 5 or 6. I can't remember. It changed over to Occult Detective magazine. And it's awesome. They're all available on Amazon. So you can get every single issue of this. And I highly recommend all of these. So fantastic stuff. Occult Detective magazine. Also, I might pick up next The Phantom City, because this is the next Doc Savage novel I have to read. And I've enjoyed all of the Doc Savage novels so far that I've read. I'm reading one Doc Savage novel a month in the order that they were originally published. And this is the 10th Doc Savage novel that appeared in Doc Savage magazine in the 1930s. The Phantom City. So we'll see how The Phantom City is. So far, these books have been dynamite. I've really enjoyed all of those. I did get a couple other things in the mail the past week. So let me mention those. So in comic books, Epic Collections from Marvel Comics and DC Finest collections from DC are exempt from the 500 book challenge, because I collect both of those series. I did get this in the mail, Ghost Rider Death Race. This is volume 3 of Ghost Rider, which has Ghost Rider issues from 1978 to 1980. So we have Ghost Rider issues number 29 through 50 in this. So that's fantastic. 50 issues of the original Ghost Rider run are available as Epic Collections. I think we probably have at least one more Epic Collection of Ghost Rider coming in this original series, maybe 2. I don't know exactly how it's going to be divided up. But that's excellent. Ghost Rider was always fun. Always a good time reading Ghost Rider. Excellent stuff. So I got this, and I was very happy to get that. Also, I got this DC Finest volume, which is Static, which is a comic I haven't read since the mid-90s, and I was pretty pleased to get this. So yeah, this has the first 15 issues of Static, and a Superman issue and a Superboy issue and some other stuff. But it's basically the first few issues of Static. And like I said, I remember enjoying this comic and buying this comic when it came out. I probably have, in fact, I almost certainly still have all of the issues in here out there in the vault, along with all my other old comics. But I remember enjoying this series, but I haven't read it. I haven't read any of these issues since the 90s. It'll be interesting to revisit these. But Static was a fun character. And yeah, this has all those early Static issues. So that's pretty cool. It's pretty cool that DC reprinted this. They've been reprinting some interesting things in their DC Finest line. I've enjoyed, or I've been happy to get everything they've done so far in DC Finest. And so, yeah, I was happy to get this. Static, that's pretty cool. And I think that's everything for this week. I think that's everything, Roger. It was kind of a light week just because I was so busy. But by the end of the day, I should have read the first 300 books in the 500 book challenge. So that's kind of a big deal. And then I'll be reading more Fantastic Four. I got to get all the Fantastic Four done because the next character I'm going to be moving on to is Spider-Man. We've decided we're going to read Spider-Man next. It was going to be Captain America, and then we said, let's just do Spider-Man. And the first run of Spider-Man lasted a while. I think the first run of Spider-Man lasted 441 issues before they decided, hey, let's cancel it and make another number one issue of that. But yeah, 441 issues of Spider-Man. We'll be following the Fantastic Four. So that'll be fun. So lots of stuff to read. Okay, I'll shut up. I will catch you next time.